ما يحمي الضعاف بخطب غير أقواها يا سيف الإله ويا.
So I think many of you are familiar with how many of these later Kalam textbooks begin, and many of you will be familiar with the Metaphysics of Ibn Sina, how it begins, and the general approach that starts with being, I think, is a very broad but distinctive approach. I just wanted to very quickly, and this is not the point of what we're doing, but just to give a very brief taste. So to show you what a henological beginning looks like. And the very interesting thing about the henological approach is that you don't have this kind of angst about epistemology. And there's a very good reason for that. And it ultimately comes down to the fact that because you are not starting with an immanentist ontology or assuming an immanentist ontology, the primariness of sensible particulars, there's all sorts of problems that don't arise and don't really need to be sorted out in the first place. There's a story about why Proclus ended up the way that he is. Of course, esoterists who believe that the more Baroque it is, the better, will think that that's absolutely wonderful and just needs to be interpreted as angels or something. But there's an actual genuine and very large controversy within Platonism between the approaches of Plotinus and the earlier representatives of the Platonic school, and what then begins with the Iamblichus and begins with the Iamblichus and then into Proclus and so on. And Proclus being really the main arch hierophant of the whole thing, as he would probably call himself. That's the Dodds edition, yeah. Is it the second edition? Could be. Let's have a look. It doesn't say it's the second edition, just 1963. It's reprinted. It's an absolutely brilliant book. In any case, so he probably threatened by Christianity and the way that Christianity was encroaching on the territory of Neoplatonism and pagan religion in general, Iamblichus and especially Proclus tried to revive a full-blown polytheistic pantheon, which was not meant to be taken symbolically or as just representing metaphysical principles, although of course he understands them to represent metaphysical principles, but they were meant to be worshipped. And they were meant to be invoked, and all sorts of different aspects of theurgical practice. It was seen that the real noesis, which or direct metaphysical knowledge that the Platonists were after, could only be achieved through the practice of theurgy. And this marked a very, very massive difference with Plotinus. Plotinus doesn't have a trace of polytheism in him. There is an ambiguity in Greek about Theos, where Theos is, the word for God is thrown around. Sometimes it means divine, sometimes it's used very, very loosely. But it's very, very clear with Plotinus that he doesn't accept the real agency. I mean, his is fundamentally a theophanic metaphysics, which is rooted in the one and intellect which arises from the overflowing of the one, and then the traces of the forms becoming manifest across the maratib of existence. But he doesn't acknowledge a theurgic commitment as being necessary to achieving union with the world of the forms or achieving union with the one. And then, of course, there's the famous controversy between Plotinus' student Porphyry and Iamblichus, because Porphyry takes issue with what are broadly the theurgical practices of some of the Egyptian priests that he's encountered. Some people think the particular Egyptian priest that he's referring to in his famous work is actually the same one mentioned in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, which is a very, very interesting. You must go and have a look at Porphyry's Life of Plotinus if you haven't seen it. I highly recommend it. Please go and read it. Just go and read it. In McKenna's translation, Mackena, you must read it. It's absolutely fantastic. In any case, Porphyry has this controversy with Iamblichus, who's trying to then justify the practice of theurgy, and they bring in all sorts of texts which are floating around at the time, whether they be the part of the Corpus Hermeticum and other important texts which belong to what are understood to be, in some measure, revealed traditions of, let me just let in Shafat Jamal, traditions of inspiration, and which were taken basically as scriptures by many of the later Neoplatonists. And so they added that, in addition to what Proclus would call the Platonic revelation, they brought in these other sources. So Proclus is an extraordinary metaphysician, but he's someone who you might not necessarily really get to the heart of the matter in what he's talking about when we're talking about metaphysics in this sense of general metaphysics, if you go to the Platonic theology. At the beginning of the elements of his elements, pan plethos meteche pe tu henos, every manifold in some way participates unity. And so he starts with this principle, which is absolutely incontrovertible, this is the way in which the Platonists managed to completely skip all of the epistemological angst that you might get if you start with existence. And he says, so he has his own commentary. Then he says, proposition 2, all that participates unity is both one and not one. Then he says, proposition 3, all that becomes one does so by participation of unity. Then he says, proposition 4, all that is unified is other than the one itself. Proposition 5, every manifold is posterior to the one. Proposition 6, every manifold is composed either of unified groups or of haenads. Proposition 7, every productive cause is superior to that which it produces. And this is, we get the beginning of a deduction of hierarchy. Proposition 6, all that in any way participates the good is subordinate to the primal good, which is nothing else but good. Proposition 9, all that is self-sufficient, either in its existence or in its activity, is superior to what is not self-sufficient, but dependent upon another existence, which is the cause of its completeness. Proposition 10, all that is self-sufficient is inferior to the unqualified good. Proposition 11, all that exists proceeds from a single first cause. These all have his commentary with his demonstrations after. Proposition 13, all that exists has the good as its principium and first cause. Proposition 13, every good tends to unify what participates it. And all unification is a good, and the good is identical with the one. And this is the unification of metaphysics and ethics right there. Solves all of so much of the angst of trying to work out the principles of the ethical tradition we don't have these starting points. Then it goes into of the grades of reality. I'm only trying to introduce that for anyone who's not familiar with it, because I think it's very important in what we're doing today to understand different methodological approaches. I do think that the Akbarian tradition is very close to the Neoplatonic tradition in many ways, but it's important to also realize that many have assumed over the years that the Akbarian tradition comes directly out of the Neoplatonic tradition. It simply doesn't. It's even more extraordinary than that, which is that reality is intrinsically intelligible. And there are many things that the Neoplatonists got not quite right, but there are many things that they got right. And they were basically facing a philosophical opposition in broadly the peripatetics, although there are of course others who, for pretty obvious reasons, had a very similar immanentist metaphysics to the later kalam theologians and to Avicenna, with many qualifications, of course. And so when you read the Akbarians critiquing immanentist metaphysics, they're very often doing it in exactly the same way that the Neoplatonists are, but it's not because they took it from the Neoplatonists. And we know that with a large degree of certainty, because if you look at the books like Kitab al-Idah fil Khair al-Mahd, which is a paraphrase, by the way, of this very book, very, very influential in the Muslim world early on, and then very influential in the Latin world as Liberté Causis, which is a translation of Kitab al-Idah. It's a creative paraphrase of the elements of theology, but it's lacking, I think it's about 70% of the book. And there's an awful lot else by Proclus, who it's very difficult to exaggerate his influence, Proclus, on the not only all the Neoplatonists that came after him, but then the Christian Middle Ages and also in the Muslim world, but obviously in this truncated form, and indeed in the Christian world in this truncated form until a certain point when the rest of his works are translated. But there's an awful lot that doesn't get true. It's interesting that the henological aspect of the Neoplatonists becomes ontologized. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. And so we have very much a wujudi metaphysics in the Islamic tradition. However, again, with the Akbarians, when you look at it more carefully, you find that it's actually a henological metaphysics. It's not an ontological metaphysics, but it's just by another name. And actually, of course, you know, the al-wahda, al-ahadiyya, al-wahidiyya, as these fundamental principles, you can't really get more henological than that. That's what's really going on in the Akbarian tradition. The idea of martabat al-la ta'ayyun, exactly the same as epikenetes usias, beyond being, because it's beyond determinate being. Al-martabat al-la ta'ayyun, which is, you know, the martaba al-wujud al-mutlaq. Absolutely, Maulana Ibrahim. We will in just a moment, Habibi. So this is very interesting for understanding the development of our own tradition, also the theology of Aristotle as it was understood to be, which was very influential, and that's a paraphrase of Plotinus' Ennead. But that again is a very, very truncated work. You do get things obviously from the metaphysical tradition, like from the Neoplatonic tradition, like identifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as al-Khair al-Mahd, as the good, which does come into Shaykh al-Akbar. If you look at al-Khair al-Mahd in Futhat al-Makkiyah, you'll find it. And that was in the scholarly tradition. It's important to realize that these great mukashafin would not themselves say that every single word that they wrote is from Cash. Part of it is from within a scholarly tradition. Some people get very upset by that, but it's just a fact. I mean, ask yourself, why did Sheikh al-Akbar go and study 300 books with different teachers if everything he wrote was from Cash? Now, when I say it's not that everything he wrote was from Cash, when he says himself everything he wrote was from Cash, that's not what I mean. Everything was inspired, but in terms of the scholarly apparatus that he possessed to put it down, of course, it's informed by his scholarly context, and he very often refers to scholarly debates which are ongoing, and usually gives an extraordinary tahqiq that it's kind of miraculous. But so it's very important that what we're doing today is, when we're doing i'adat nazar at our methodological foundations, is that we become aware of different traditions, that we don't assume that everything is already known to us, or that the great people of our past in our tradition, well, they did have it all, but there's a difference between truth as uncovered and as realized, and the self-actualization and perfection that those perfect men, may Allah give us the share of by His mercy of their barakah, their uncovering of reality is as good as it gets, but that's not something that's necessarily publicly available. Can we necessarily apply an experience that we've never had to can we apply an experience we've never had to facing some of the obstacles to spiritual realization that we face as a result of the pressures of modernity, unless we have an intellectual framework which allows us to capture those experiences of true being that those wonderful saints who had those experiences, into a framework that illuminates the philosophical context in which we find ourselves. Are even the intellectual frameworks they left necessarily capable of doing that? Not necessarily. And it's not necessarily going to be because they are naqis in any way. They're not naqis in any way. They're absolutely perfect, but they weren't facing, just to state the obvious, bleedingly obvious, blindingly obvious, they weren't facing the same challenges that we are. And so we should really get down to reading. I just don't know what came over me. But someone asked about henological, and I think you missed, dear Ibrahim, the first session. And so ontology, you might say, is the study of being, what is being, what beings are there, and so on. And henology is the study of unity. What is unity? What is, I'm getting woozy from, thank you for sending these questions. They're absolutely wonderful, but every time they appear, my brain just gets woozy because I can't breathe properly at the moment. That's my excuse. But I'll get to them, inshallah. So henology is the study of unity, of tawheed, how things become beings by participating in unity, and how unity constitutes the ground of the intelligibility of the world and the distinctness of the world, because if things are not unity and unities and they don't present Every manifold, as Proclus said, pan plethos metechepe to henos, every manifold in some way participates unity. You can't envisage, you can't even conceive of a manifold unless it comes under a unity. Why? Because you wouldn't even be able to say a manifold. What manifold are you doing? You mean that one, the one which is under a unity. And so it's Henology which uncovers the intelligibility of the world and accounts for not only the knowability of the world, but also the being of the world. And so in that sense, in the Neoplatonic tradition, rather than being convertible with unity, being is actually posterior to unity. And that sounds kind of paradoxical, and it is, but it's actually, on the other hand, it's not contradictory. I mean, it doesn't lead to any formal contradictions. Bil'aks, it's very illuminating as a philosophical path. It doesn't mean that there isn't a harmony that you can have between ontological approach and henological. There is. But in any case, Sidi Sachi, we'll go on to the question about theurgy a bit later on, inshallah, if you don't mind. So, Sidi Asif, would you mind reading?
Sure.
Thank you.
Diverse identifications of the nature of Nafs al-Amr are made across various forms of later Islamic theology and philosophy. As we will see in this study, some identify Nafs al-Amr with metaphysical entities, like the Avicennan intellect, or the Akbarian immutable.
They say we can't hear very well. Can you really, I think you have a kind of theatrical dimension, just really.
Or the Akbarian immutable archetypes, al-Ayan. These types of theories, though highly divergent in many important ways, shared in emphasizing that human minds are fundamentally receptacles of a truth that originates in an intelligible realm even more fully real than the world of sense experience. It's only through the mind's conjunction with that truth, by means of the effusion of those higher realms into the sublunar world, that knowledge can be attained. For truth is, in essence, a metaphysical phenomenon. Other thinkers adopted what can seem to be a reductively epistemological approach to Nafs al-Amr by suggesting that it simply refers to the truth judgment that arises from the intuition of both self-evident and speculative necessity. Yet others made more prosaic but nonetheless ontological identification of Nafs al-Amr with a combination of the individuated extramental world and the mind. We would argue that this latter approach tends to beg the question in the traditional sense of assuming something that ought to be proved first. Namely, that the mere obtainment of true propositions in minds can validly account for their truth.
Who knows what begging the question is in Arabic? Musadara. I didn't expect anyone to get that. Brilliant. Did we cover that in logic class? I don't think we did. Really? All right. Fine. Thank you, Sidi. I'm munbahir. So truth as contained within immanent experience. So, when we talk about this reductively epistemological approach, which would be the standard understanding, I mean, it really comes basically from the question, can the phenomenon of truth be accounted for by individual immanent experience? Can the phenomenon of truth be accounted for by individual immanent experience? Most modern people would say yes, because of the education that we have. They'd say yes. You don't need to think of truth as a metaphysical phenomenon. Truth is just some variety of a correspondence theory, if you want to really push it, which they prefer not to, for very good reasons. But it's some variety of correspondence theory. When I say something about the world, which I believe to be true, it's because ultimately there is some feature of the world which I can experience, which makes it thus, and therefore, and then, whatever variety of higher order statements we then end up making about that must be empirical thing are in some way reducible to the empirical thing. And so, this is broadly speaking, the very, very broad standard view, which is that we talk about truth in science, in popular science books, on television, in politics, and so on. And what we're basically talking about is something which you don't have to talk about an unseen or a metaphysical world to account for truth. It's just a very common sense, basic thing that, if I say Asif is here and he's very interested, then, I have a sense experience of Asif as a particular, which I can, the particular is defined as where it's defined lots of different ways, not necessarily a logical way, which is ما يمنع نفسه تسلم مفهوم عن وقود الشرك بين الكثيرين, but just ما يقبل الإشارة الحسية. I can point to Asif, and so he's there, and then there's various evidence from his facial expressions on, which is suggesting that he's very interested. Now, so this is all, I've accounted for the truth of these propositions with purely empirical features. I don't need to go beyond it. And then there are various ways of accounting for other varieties of truth. Now, so this is what you would call the immanentist approach, what I've called here the reductively epistemological approach. So we can reduce somehow the concept of truth to something which rests on logical necessity. So ultimately, the principle of non-contradiction is not consistently deniable, because when you try to deny it, you're already assuming it's true. Otherwise, what you said wouldn't be possible, because you believe what you're saying is true, for one thing, and not false, and so on. So there's this understanding that the truth can be reduced simply to some type of logical necessity. Then, now, the difficulties that this problem faces are many, but one of the most basic is that metaphysical principles already inform the domain to which you are appealing as putatively self-explanatory when you try to give that type of common sense empirical account of truth. So I say, well, how do you know it's true? Well, look, here is the empirical particular that evinces those features. Therefore, that's all I need to. There's a correspondence between my mental representation of this and the thing out there. Now, the problem is that empirical particular is a particular. Therefore, it stands under wahda. Therefore, it's a manifold in a unity. Therefore, it stands in relations to other things. Therefore, it must be a possible being, otherwise it wouldn't be there. Therefore, it must, if it's individuated and distinct, there must be some essence that it's participating in. So it's no good appealing to the empirical particulars if that provides an exhaustive explanation, because the intelligibility of that empirical particular is contingent upon all sorts of irreducibly metaphysical principles. So that's one thing. That's, of course, in large part what this book is about. But then we have, so there's almost nothing you can say about a thing that has a sensible referent. And so what they're trying to do is give us a putatively common sense account of what truth is, but that itself begs the question. So we will argue that this latter approach tends to beg the question in the traditional sense of assuming something that ought to be proved first, which is broadly al-musadara and al-matlub, namely that the mere obtainment of true propositions in minds can validly account for their truth. That's slightly different to what I was just saying, because the way it's framed in that sentence is so as to link it into the way that it's framed in the development of the way the masail unfold in what follows, because when you're talking about correspondence, so let's say you have a proposition which doesn't have an extramental particular referent, like a sensible referent, like as if is a unity, you say, well, okay, it doesn't correspond to the extramental particular because I can't isolate that property. I can isolate the particular features of his watch, or the particular things that he's wearing, and particular height, and so on, and the way that Asif participates in the various categories. But when it comes to accounting for the ontological rootedness of particular of those non-sensible properties, there's nothing that I can point to in the empirical particular per se that actually accounts for it. So they would say, well, that means that what's being corresponded to here is just the mind. So they try to make it very nice and simple. Nafs al-amr is just extramental particulars and the mind, right? So as we will see very soon, well, just being in a mind doesn't make something true. And what you're trying to appeal to is the idea that, well, there's a mental form of unity, multiplicity, darura, imkan, conjunction, whatever, all of those things, of which there are many. I just keep on repeating the same ones because I'm not very imaginative. But we can say there's a mental form of those things, and that's what is corresponded to. Well, what about 1 + 1 = 3? That also has a mental form, but it's not true. So there's something odd going on here. Truth seems to be something beyond, when it's talking about abstract truths, beyond the mere fact of obtaining in a mind. So do you think you could go on, Yemen? Thank you.
Hence the importance of the question of the identity of Nafs al-Amr, particularly in the times in which we are living. The requirements of genuine logical rigor entail the insufficiency of the mere provision of putative proofs for the tenets of Islamic creed. This is because, even more fundamentally, our method of providing proof must be demonstrated to be sound. As we indicated at the beginning of this chapter, our contemporary circumstances dictate that justification must be newly provided for the metaphysical principles presupposed by our natural theology. How can we be certain that these principles and concepts, which do not seem to have reference in the physical world, actually possess an objective extramental basis? This is an aspect of the question of the ontological status of intelligible entities, namely those that are not the objects of the senses, but are directly known by the mind, and of the question of if, and if so, how they apply to sensible particulars so as to render the world truly intelligible, in the other sense of intelligible, which means objectively knowable. These are two of the most fundamental questions in all of philosophy. If the human mind itself is the wellspring and original ultimate locus of certain types of intelligible entities, fundamental to the operation of the sciences, it seems impossible to escape from the implication of subjectivism, which calls the validity of the whole edifice of traditional natural theology into serious question.
We hope there. So, why is Nafs al-Amr so important? The question of Nafs al-Amr, why was this identified at the outset of this project when I was asked by Dr. Quine to look into Nafs al-Amr rather than something else? We were trying to find what are the most fundamental questions of today, the most fundamental. And so one is the status of first principles, which is what Dr. Quine dealt with in his book very beautifully. One is the question of definition, and how can traditional definition of genus and differential be defensible today, and what is the metaphysical framework which would enable us to demonstrate that definition, that it remains possible to know the world within a realist framework, know the essences of things, and that definition by genus and differential remains not only a defensible way, not only a defensible way, but the only real way to define, to know the essence of things, not in an ultimate sense in terms of cash flow or things which are exceptional, but in terms of the usual conditions of intelligibility and the intrinsic capacities of the human intellect. And Nafs al-Amr was also seen as being a very fundamental and very important aspect of an adequately full picture. And one of the most fundamental reasons for this is because determining the nature of objective reality, one of the most major difficulties that it faces is exactly the assumption that there is this intrinsic split between knowing and being, and this way of framing it was suggested to me by most of Aziz, and I'm forever grateful for that, but there is an intrinsic split between knowing and being. Somehow, because we are individual knowing subjects, and usually because we have some sort of naturalistic assumption that the real world is this kind of undifferentiated brute stuff of this nature, and that we are these individual beings who have emerged, and we cannot but be imposing our way of representing the world onto the world. Now that makes a kind of sense. If we don't emerge, if the intellect isn't in some real sense embedded in the nature of things, then you would naturally think we have to be imposing order upon the world. We have to be imposing the intelligibility that we believe the world intrinsically has and is somehow giving to us in fi'aliyan. That would have to be imposed upon the world. So the question of Nafs al-Amr is extraordinary because it was traditionally framed as the question of how do we account for truths that we know to be truths that the sciences can't do without, in fact, which are many more than the truths that we can account for under a correspondence theory of corresponding to experimental particulars. How do we correspond? What is the Nafs al-Amr of those things? It can't be their immanent appearances. It can't be just that we happen to find that I'm a person and I look at the world in this way through all of these representational categories, and other people I meet who are also human beings also seem to broadly look at the world under the same representational categories. And that's it. It's their only existence is their immanent existence. It's not because they are rooted in the nature of things. And so the requirements of general logical rigor entail the insufficiency of the mere provision of views of proofs. Does that mean that we're doing something completely new and, the poor Aslaf just weren't sophisticated enough to think about these questions? Well, that's the modernist assumption, and the answer is absolutely not. And that's one of the extraordinary things about the way that the question of Nafs al-Amr is framed. They did deal with that question. And that exactly when they're framing the central aporia of Nafs al-Amr, it is the question of, well, the truth of a proposition is its correspondence to Nafs al-Amr. But we have these whole shelves of propositions which don't seem to correspond to the Nafs al-Amrs that we can think about, which are the sensible particular and the mind. What else is there? That's all we can directly experience, surely, is the extramental particular in the mind. So how do we account for the truth of these things? This is extraordinary. They did deal with the question, what's different? What's different is the angle that we're coming from is now entirely different. And that's because they were not arguing from a position of doubt and this assumption that the world is fundamentally not intelligible, and this assumption that is more intuitive, more it's almost self-evident that our intelligible representation of the world must be imposed upon the world. They weren't coming from a position of doubt. They were coming from just the fact that philosophy is معرفة حقائق الأشياء على ما هي عليها في نفس الأمر على قدر الطاقة البشرية, whatever the definition is. That's what philosophy is doing. It's trying to uncover what is the true nature of reality. And so when they come to a problem like this, it is okay, well, in this case, we also need to find out what is the true nature of reality. And so it just becomes another question amongst questions, not a kind of terrible angst. But for the modern mind, this is a terrible angst. And that's partly a consequence of the thought of Kant. But it means that we're coming at it from, it becomes a foundational question. It becomes our justification for doing metaphysics. It becomes our kind of counter to what has taken on a life of its own and what we would consider to be a terrible deterioration of Western thought, but that has become so ubiquitous and widely held that it's almost taken to be self-evident. So, including by many Muslims, and many Muslims today who are practicing traditional kalam will blindly accept all of these principles of philosophies of modernity, which assume that reality is fundamentally unintelligible and that demonstrative knowledge of metaphysical truths is impossible. So that's one of the things that I hope that's very clear. Could we go on?
It is the determination of the nature of nafs al-amr, the domain of reference that makes true propositions true, and in which the objects or states of affairs to which they refer ultimately subsist. That constitutes the key to guaranteeing the objective extramental basis. If abstract objects, alongside a broader range of intelligible concepts and principles, can be shown to be rooted in nafs al-amr, conceived as an ontological reality, and can be shown in nafs al-amr to genuinely apply to the world of sensible experience, the soundness of the metaphysics-based natural theology upon which the traditional Islamic worldview depends will have been borne out at the most fundamental of levels. It will have been demonstrated that they are truly objective principles of sciences worthy of the name. Moreover, the traditional claim that the other sciences are subordinated to metaphysics and derive their first principles therefrom will find substantiation. For if the metaphysical first principles and abstract universal concepts underpinning the sciences can be shown to rest on firm foundations, indeed to inhere in a level of existence beyond that of immediate individual experience, we will possess an ontological justification for our sense of their supra-subjective truth, instead of being forced to find warrant for those principles phenomenologically in the sheer fact of subjective perception.
Can you stop me there? And I've just put the note. In this way, it's not an actual note, just what I was trying to say. In this way, is the answer to the question, are they true beings? So going back to our thing about wujud al-haq, what means wujud al-haq, evokes this idea of true being, ontos on, and in fact also includes the notion of true being as emerging from Allah. So what we're asking really is all of these abstract propositions abstract is not a good word, as we'll discuss later, but all these abstract propositions, these intelligible entities, all of these intelligible entities, are they true being? Because the naturalist believes in true being, funnily enough, but says, well, no, true being is just, well, if he's really bad, he'll say it's just primary qualities or something like that. But is broadly the sensible empirical world. So our question really is, are our metaphysical apparatuses ultimately, do they possess true being? Not in their immanent form, because remember, the immanent reality of something is just insofar as I'm experiencing it, insofar as you're experiencing it, insofar as Maulana Sidiman is experiencing it, insofar as any individual human being is experiencing our intrinsically human metaphysical apparatuses, that's the immanent reality of them. And what the immanentist says is, it doesn't go beyond that. It just appears in human minds. But I mean, even the structure of the language suggests that it has a transcendent reality. It appears in human minds. Well, where is it before it appears in? But anyway, it appears in human minds. The immanentist says, no, that's just a trick of the language. It only appears in human minds. Its only existence is in its manifestations. The exemplarist says, no, that would be impossible unless it was rooted in being prior to its emergence in any particular mind. So that is the kind of fundamental difference there.
This would in turn serve to forestall the skeptical attempt, which has in the main arisen from certain streams and rivulets of post-17th century Western philosophy, to undermine the traditional metaphysics presupposed by natural theology. It might also contribute to the prevention of an equally perilous phenomenon, modern practitioners of kalam coming to be intimidated by the skeptical challenge of modern philosophy and the apparently overwhelming success of modern science, such that kalam, as traditionally understood, is undermined in finding itself compelled to make certain foundational concessions to the prevailing intellectual Weltanschauung of the modern age. Inevitably, this would lead to a subversion of their own discipline, enabling it to operate from these often Pyrrhonist starting points. The aim underlying such a move might be to capacitate kalam in a new role as a mere validator, a handmaiden of an inductive modern science that aspires to the realization of merely probable models, but not to truth as traditionally understood. One major stream of contemporary anti-metaphysical analytic philosophy has already self-proclaimedly met this very fate. Already signs of the gathering popularity.
Could I just read that note? I'm so sorry. So note 8 on page 167. When we say one school, major school of analytic philosophy has already self-proclaimedly met that fate, number 8, namely that of W.V. Quine, 1908 to 2000, who developed the philosophy of the Vienna Circle into his own nominalist, deflationist, behaviorist, and scienticist anti-system, and who celebrated what he viewed as one of the main achievements of empiricism after 1800, namely naturalism, abandonment of the goal of the first philosophy prior to natural science. And that's in his W.V. Quine, his irreverently named Theories and Things, Cambridge, Belknap Press, 1986. He is widely revered as one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century.
Already signs of the gathering popularity of such approaches among certain contemporary practitioners of kalam are sadly all too conspicuous.
Sadly, all too conspicuous.
For the vast majority of Western philosophical history, and for many up until the present day, objective metaphysical knowledge has been understood to be within the reach of humankind. Indeed, it was philosophy that served to validate the truth claims of all of the other sciences. As in the Islamic tradition, this view found some of its roots in theories of truth, ultimately traceable to Plato and Aristotle, and the Neoplatonic tradition that succeeded them. These shared origins developed in the writings of Avicenna into a distinctive logical, epistemological, and metaphysical system of an almost unparalleled comprehensiveness and maturity, whose influence was uniquely central to both Islamic philosophy and medieval European scholasticism. Thereafter, of course, the two traditions largely parted ways. This study chiefly concerns theories of the ultimate metaphysical guarantors of truth claims within Islamic philosophical traditions, the most valuable developments of which came in the period after the Western and Islamic traditions diverged. However, in chapter 2, we provide a short exposition of the most fundamental features of the development in the Western tradition of theories of the grounds of metaphysical truth. This is both in order to bring theories from our own tradition into sharper relief, as well as to implicitly frame the question of how these theories might be applicable to the dominant contemporary philosophical context. After all, this context amounts to the degeneration of a Western philosophical heritage, whose roots extend back to a time when Western and Islamic philosophy shared much in common.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts, anyone, before we move on? Let me look in the chat. Oh, can you come up and ask them, Yamelana?
Why it's new Platonic? It's like new Platon. I don't know anything. So, what is the difference between what is the difference between? Okay, what is the difference between new Platonism, and Platonism? Is it the advent of Christianity, or?
Thank you.
So, second question related to it. So, when you kindly said that Ibn Arabi and like there is lots of conversion between them without any mutual interaction or like they reading one another. How would we reconcile this with tahsin and taqbih al-aqli? So how come they arrived at like what you see as like true or like conclusions without revelation? Or is it because of the influence of Christianity again, or because you can arrive at nafs al-amr without?
Well, because of the intrinsic intelligibility of reality, without which you wouldn't be able to recognize the truth of revelation. If reality wasn't intrinsically intelligible, you wouldn't be able to find out if your revelation was true or not. It's not enough oxygen. It's a very important question, this one about, someone got their hand up because my desktop is just a total chaos here. Oh, it's Sachi, all right. The question about Platonism and Neoplatonism, very, very important. Now, the Neoplatonism is a term that I'm just using for convenience, really, because it's just well known to people. وَلَا مُشَاحَةَ فِي الْإِسْتِلَاحِ. But actually, Neoplatonism is a pejorative term that comes from a particular historiography, a particular theory about the history of philosophy. And this really finds its origin in the work of Schleiermacher, who in the German context was responsible for a revival of Platonic studies, but had a very different attitude to someone like Thomas Taylor, who was largely responsible for for a revival of Platonism in the Anglophone world. But Schleiermacher was very highly influential, and he believed that the dialogues do not represent a philosophical system. Plato was not a systematic philosopher. And these are kind of searching, beautiful literary productions which provide a dialectical method. Now, it's interesting that Plato himself considered dialectic to be what we would consider to be Borhani. He didn't consider that to be Jadali. That's a whole nother story. But there's this kind of dialectical process. They're basically excellent conversations by very clever people, which basically ultimately lead to types of skepticism. And that there's not really much more to it than that. Productions of genius, but not a philosophical system. And so when the Neoplatonists then came along later and tried to claim that they were merely commentators on Plato, and they're kind of, very, in the case of someone like Proclus, very, very scholastic, rigorously logical, philosophical systems. They're claimed to merely be commentators on Plato and just to be uncovering Plato's philosophy, just didn't stand up to reason. And that came to be basically the standard view over the next couple of hundred years, or over 100 years. And so, this is the type of view that essentially becomes standard with the last generation of scholars of Plato. It would be people like Gregory Vlastos, people like Bostock, people like Dominic Scott, people like Taylor, not Thomas Taylor, and so these are. This is when I was doing my undergraduate and I had to do my Plato module. This is the position that I was given. Now, the Neoplatonists, as they became called, who considered themselves just to be Platonists, didn't believe that in the slightest. They believed in the first place that the dialogues, and this is confirmed by later scholarship, the dialogues are only Plato's dialogues. In the case of Aristotle, it's not known by everyone that the works of Aristotle that we have are actually just his lecture notes. They're not his dialogues. In fact, Aristotle also had dialogues, very beautiful dialogues, apparently. Some of them are preserved in the works of later thinkers. But all we possess in the case of Aristotle are his lecture notes, and all we possess in the case of Plato are his dialogues, which were meant to be popularized, which were meant to capture truths in a very sophisticated manner, but a manner that would make it possible for them to be understood via many different ways of approach. But we don't possess Plato's lecture notes. We do have some accounts of his lectures, which were very, very technical, quite a lot more technical than Aristotle, actually. And so we have this tradition of the unwritten doctrines of Plato, doctrines which form the systematic basis of his philosophy, but that are only hinted at in the dialogues. And then Plato says in certain places, especially in some of his letters, that he would never dream of putting down his real doctrines in writing, and you'll never find him writing them down. He promises never to do it. And so there's this tradition. The way that the Neoplatonists saw Plato was rather like someone like Maulana Sheikh al-Akbar in certain ways. I shouldn't really say anything about him at all, but the way that he saw Plato, in that Plato is very unusual amongst philosophers in that his main source of knowledge was dhawq. And there's also Abdul Karim al-Jili tells us that al-Khidr used to attend Plato's lectures. He would go to Plato's lectures, and that was a must. So that's a very different way of looking at the type of person Plato was. Of course, Plato as Dr. Quine was telling me the other day, is also in the line of the Hermetic silsila. And one of the, of course, something very, very widespread in an account of Plato and the Ishraqiyun in general is that they took the ulum from the baqaya of the ulum of the Anbiya, especially Sayyidina Idris. So that's a very different way of looking at someone like Plato, and broadly the Neoplatonists looked at Plato, in a very, very broad way, they looked at Plato a bit like that. And later scholarship, what's very interesting is that later scholarship has almost flipped the consensus on its head. And so that's why some of the books that we've mentioned before are in the bibliography that was posted. The trilogy by Lloyd Gerson, Platonism and Naturalism, From Plato to Platonism, and Aristotle and Other Platonists is very important. And also J.N. Findlay's Plato, the Written and Unwritten Doctrines, and then an article which he has, which is the three hypostases. It's in here. The three hypostases of Platonism, which is also very important in that regard. Siddhi Sachi, you wanted to comment.
Saying that what the metaphysical framework which you can use to solve modern problems.
Could you shout as much as possible?
Yeah. So what you said there. Can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Oh, okay. Saying earlier, when you said that our scholars in the past might not have shared the same metaphysical framework, or framework we can use.
You might not have shared our metaphysical framework, yeah.
Yeah, but what we need in the modern time is a framework that can solve the problems of our day, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just repeating you because you're breaking up a bit. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm wondering is, if we go for a henological framework to solve the problems of the day, given that the basic principles of this framework, like the one which is beyond being, to even understand that, it's not something imminent. It is imminent in some sense because everything participates in it, right? But you have to take people there, right, for them to see that principle, to really understand it. They can't do that off the bat, right? You have to sort of take them there. So are we not going back to an immanentist framework in the sense that we have to start there, and that has to be our support to get to that henological framework, right? And once we get to that henological framework, we can kick away the ladder, so to speak, right? But then we have to, start with the immanent, right? Because even when you're talking about unity, you're saying, look, this thing there or that thing there, right? So to explain the one and how everything participates in the one, you have to talk about those things, right?
Yeah.
The very worldly kind of things. Yeah. Yep.
That's a brilliant question. And it's very true. This is, as Sheikh Abdul Qadir would say, what this framework allows you is to see reality with no split in it. There is no split in reality. So we're not saying that the immanent is bad or it doesn't have its place. We're just saying that the immanent is not everything that there is, and that when you have a philosophy that tries to make it everything, you end up in all sorts of disasters. Like Ibn Baha'u'ddin says, every time they fall into a new warta, they get out of one, they fall into another one with that framework, because that framework just doesn't make sense. But yes, of course. Now, on the one hand, Henology doesn't just mean the mystical vision of the one. The Henology is also taking unity as your starting point. If your first proposition, your starting point in your metaphysics. Of course, there's no real starting point of metaphysics because we're already there. Because just by being human beings who are metaphysical beings, we're already doing metaphysics. So there's no starting point, like where's my starting point going to be of metaphysics if I don't get the right starting point. But no, in a systematic context, if your starting point is every manifold participates in unity, and it doesn't get any more basic than that, you're not starting with, well, being is self-evident. Tayyib, so what? What are the systematic consequences of being self-evident? Maybe there are many systematic consequences, but it's a different approach. I would argue that it lends itself to an immanentist approach. It's not really transitive, that insight. It's like being self-evident. Tayyib, wabarding. What then? Whereas when you say every manifold participates unity, you've already started uncovering a hierarchy of being. Now, there is a convergence because your immanent, you might say your proximate principle of unity might be an object of experience in some way or other. But then you will be able to deduce that the next principle of unity that object of experience requires must be transcendent. There's no other way. There's no two ways about it. Now, with the concept of epistrophe and prodos and of precession and reversion and the concept of taraqi and spiritual ascension and tasfiyah in our tradition and purification also in the Platonic tradition, those transcendent entities can also be objects of experience. But there's a convergence between the uncovering of the intellectual framework and the uncovering of the mystical framework. So often today you get what I call esoterism, which is not a very good word, but it's just the ism I like here, as an epistemological approach. Of course, we all aspire to the tariqah of kashf, I believe, or many of us, but esoterism is not that. Esoterism is the idea that the only real source of knowledge is mystical experience. Now that sounds great. It's very popular amongst Sufi converts to Islam, but it's enormously, perilously dangerous, because if mystical experience is our only real source of knowledge, then you may as well adopt the entire modern world. It's not a problem, because there's this split in reality. That is just like al-dunya, it's just alam al-dunya, and therefore, well, it's alam al-dunya, we just deal with it on its own terms. And, it's my mystical flight that is giving me the real knowledge. Now, of course, the real knowledge of real being is through mystical experience, because the locus of knowledge is the human heart, which is informed by the spirit, and we want to uncover our spirits in alam al-arwah and be unified with them, and then see everything as transfigured by unification with our original self. But that's very, very different to thinking that everything other than that pristine mystical experience is unknowable, is beyond the pale, is not really intelligible, is relative, could go either way. This one has their epistemological approach. This one has their epistemological. We have to tolerate them all because it's ultimately undecidable. And this is just logic chopping, it's just ultimately just nafs and a waste of time. And what you have to have is your mystical flight, which is, of course, a wonderful thing that we all would hope to have. Mm. But that is not the way of our tradition at all. It's phenomenally dangerous. It leads directly and straight away to this kind of crass universalism, crass relativism, crass unthinking adoption of the modern world, and the modern view of the world. And it's just not something that our scholars ever believed, not in ilm al-kalam, not in ilm al-tasawwuf, not in metaphysical Sufism, not in falsafa. And so when people come and say, oh, this is the tradition because, you know, Rumi said that, you know, aql is like a wooden spoon or something. Khalas, yani, look at all the other things he said. Look at him in his context. That is not what he means. He's talking about in relationship, in the light of of direct acquaintance, that knowing reality from behind a veil, when compared with that, it's as if it's nothing. But it wouldn't even occur to someone of that time to say, well, that means that, like, khalas, this aql that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us to illuminate our world is all like khalas, it's all subjective. There's nonsense. They never thought that. So that's an important thing. Can't remember what we were talking about. Has anyone else got a question? Tfaddal, ya habibi. Tfaddal.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sidi. You mentioned that in the Akbarian tradition, the henological metaphysics gets ontologized. And you said that in this henological tradition, being is posterior to unity. So I wanted to ask, so what is unity? What is the kind of the being of unity? Do we, you mentioned that there's no contradiction in this, but I was just curious if you'd elaborate.
This is not a question of whether, of course, the one exists. Of course, unity exists. Of course, now it's not a question of, you know, being is a self-evident concept. Anything which is determinate, yes, we say it exists. Now, this is fundamentally and the source of the determinant must also exist. But this is a question of so that's uncontroversial. There's no one saying, well, when we say the one is beyond being, it means he doesn't really exist. Malish, you know? It's just a mystical thing you can't understand, which I have heard people saying actually, which is not tenable. And I think Plotinus and Proclus would certainly be turning in their graves. Basically what it means is the one is beyond being because the one is not determinate, right? So our usual, our experiential knowledge of being is being as the determinate, right? But there is a type of being that transcends the determinate, not because it's pure being, but because it is a principle of ultimate unity. Its being is just an i'tibari concept. It's this and that. Yani, it's not primary. Why is the one primary? Why is unity primary? Not just in the sense of the one. It's because it's only by participating in one that in one or in unity that something can be determinate, right? You only exist as what you are because of your principles of unity, which enable that manifold to, I can say that's Uzair. It's not just this inchoate mess of hashakum, of sense data. This is Uzair. He participates. There's a substantial unity, which is his individuality, but you're rendered intelligible as a human being. Forgive me for doing this, referring to me. I didn't actually intend to. It just comes out like that. You're rendered intelligible as a human being because you participate in human nature, right? So unity broadly is prior to being because it's by participating in unity that beings can be beings. That's how they're able to be beings. So it's the principle of determinateness. is unity. Now, could you say that's being? You could. But when you really, in the final analysis, that's what that part of the book is. The meaning of being, if you say, well, that thing is being, it's not unity. Excuse me, the word being becomes meaningless because you then can't, then non-being doesn't mean anything. But if you call it unity, right, multiplicity still means something. And that's why it's actually unity, which is prayer. Then you say, well, but the one exists and the one is the ultimate being. Yes, but it's not because he's pure being. It's because he's the one. His existence is just an I'tibari entity. So it's a, so Suhrawardi, Mir Damad in our tradition, I think really the Akbarians were on this side. And then, famously people like Mullah Sadra, in some broad sense, Ibn Sina, and many others on the ontological camp. Some say it's a khilaf lafzi. I don't think it's a khilaf lafzi, but whether it is or not, which it's not, going through the masail is extremely beneficial. So there's another question. Mustafa Aziz. What's misological? Like hating logic?
Yeah, like the hatred of like just dismissing reason. I often find there's a kind of similarity in the kinds of shallowness at work in either view. Some people will say, oh, if Maulana is saying that Akal is like sometimes he has some very like gruff metaphors, like Akal is like a donkey in quicksand, but then they will look at that and say, oh, that means he's basically just denying a traditional ontology or something. And I find a kind of parallel between that and people who would look at Sufis, the awliya who critique excessive emphasis on the fiqh mode of religiosity, and they'll say, oh, that means they're dismissing fiqh. I think there's a similar shallowness at work in both kinds of views.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. It's a very good parallel. Yeah. So he's saying that this is akin to rejecting the idea of sacred law because of what can go wrong with a kind of pedanticism about fiqh. And indeed, this is exactly what happens about sacred law as well. Then I'm just trying to, like how can something be determinate from that which is not determinate? Insofar, I'm trying to get this to move. Insofar as it is not determinate, or insofar as determinate, indeterminate does not apply to it. Yeah. Good question by Setchi. How can we speak about it being having a source which is not determinate, and by that we mean the indeterminate, and by the indeterminate we mean non-being, and we're not talking about it as non-being, it's the source of the determinateness. The point is it surpasses any of our limited attempts to grasp it. The one surpasses any attempt that we have to know it, that we can make to know it. And knowing is very closely identified with being in the Neoplatonic tradition. So something which surpasses determinateness, and that we're because of our multiplicity, and this is very similar to certain things that Sadruddin Al-Qunawi says, although on a very different level. But because of our multiplicity, we cannot attain to a distinct knowledge of that absoluteness. So that martabat la ta'ayyun is not accessible to us. What is accessible to us is the martabat al-wahidiyya, the apex of mystical experience, according to many of the Sufis, is knowledge of the a'yan thabita, and that is possible because they are determinate in a way which, if there's a very advanced preparedness that I certainly can't imagine, then there is the possibility of knowing these ayana thabita, even though their individuation conditions are very elevated, very unlike, poor old alam al-mulk, still they are determinate, they are finite. And so, the one is unlimited. He's beyond being, in the sense that he's beyond any possible knowledge, and knowledge is very closely intertwined with being. Maulana Mustafa, ya Habibi, Habib Albi, did you have something? I miss you, Habibi. Don't desert me.
No, Habibi, it was just a passing comment that rather than deny fiqh or aql because it seems inconvenient, or it has some afata, but it's haqq, which is better than, as you rightly said, saying that we have all these systems which everyone is clamoring for, and therefore we have to be. It's just a passing comment.
Allah dalik, ya Habib. Mushtaq lak. I miss you. I cannot see you, but I can hear you. I feel a Persian poem coming on, but unfortunately I don't have the capacities of Sidi Mustafa Aziz or Anwar or people like that. شربنا على ذكر الحبيب مدامة سكرنا بها من قبل أن يخلق الكرم, something like that.